It's the week ending Saturday, the 30th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Ryanair cancelling thousands more flights, this time over Christmas, Uber losing its licence to operate in London, and Jeremy Corbyn addressing delegates at the Labour Party conference. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team are Jamie Timson, Mike Starling, and from the Week Junior, Felicity Capon. And starting the show this week, it's Jamie. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Do you know your publics from your privates?
This square right next to St Paul's Cathedral houses the London Stock Exchange, and you might also think it is a public space, but you'd be wrong. It's actually owned by the Mitsubishi Estate Company of Japan, and so governed by corporate bylaws, not by the law of the land.
Matt Fry there, reporting for Channel 4 News on the subject of privately owned public spaces, or, here's the acronym of the week, POPs.
POPs.
Tell us about your POPs.
So this week, The Guardian revealed that they had asked Freedom of Information to ask how many privately owned public spaces there were in local authorities around the UK.
And just to clarify, what is a privately owned public space?
So these are spaces that you or I would look at and think were public areas. To give an example, Granary Square, the redevelopment around King's Cross, where there's lots of street furniture where you can sit around and you're on the outside, and it's not immediately clear to you that actually where you are sitting is in a private space. So this week, The Guardian, they asked 14 local authorities about privately owned public spaces within their cities, and only 2, Cardiff and Cambridge, were willing to disclose even some information about which of their public spaces were privately owned. Belfast and Edinburgh said they were unable to share the information, and then all of the other ones, Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, Leeds, Glasgow, they just declined to comment. It came into the public focus in 2011 when the Occupy movement tried to protest outside Paternoster Square, which is in the city, and they were moved on by by police who with a court order that said you can't protest here, and they ended up outside St Paul's. And now, I don't know about you, but I would have thought that bit outside Paternoster Square was as public as anything else. The fact that they were moved on, it really shows kind of a deficit in democracy, I think. Because being able to know what rules you're being governed by and how to challenge them is a fundamental part of democracy.
Okay, so it's about protests.
Well, it's not just about protests, though.
What else is it about? Well, what's the problem with a privately owned public space?
Well, so for instance, one example was referenced in a Londonist article. This woman was in this public space, assessing the public space, and 2 workers in overalls came and sat down on what was a street furniture of a public bench, and they were moved on. And when she asked them, why were they moved on? They were shocked. They were just eating lunch quite a way away from the building site, but in a public area. And they said, "Oh, we're sorry, but we thought that the dirt on their overalls would rub off on the street furniture." The kind of the cliche that they get given is that actually these are white collar public spaces. If you're there sitting in your overalls, but you don't fit in with the kind of ambience of the private space.
I mean, look, that's a really sort of convenient anecdote, isn't it? But I mean,
but there are loads
Felicity has
like that.
You've seen, really?
Yeah.
I mean, I've been to Canary Wharf a lot. That's sort of one of the more obviously privately owned public spaces, isn't it? Because you can see. I mean, the parks are literally named after the banks and whatever. I've never noticed as people emerge from the underground station at Canary Wharf that people are turned away because they don't look right. I mean, I
haven't noticed it, but that doesn't mean it's not going on, and it's really insidious that you're not aware of it until you look into it more. And I think the ones that caught my attention were all the cases of homeless people. There was this one guy who had an amazing quote out. He was in the King's Cross area, and he was told by a security guard that he could lie down, but he couldn't close his eyes. So he was allowed to, he couldn't sleep there basically, he'd be moved on, but he could sort of rest. And I think also things like the protesting is actually really important, because actually our parks and our public spaces are traditionally where people would gather to form a protest to if they felt their rights were under threat. So it's really ironic now that those spaces are the places that you can't do that anymore. anymore. And I think it's more the fact, if you were ever, I mean, I'm not about to start an Occupy movement protest, but if I was and I found out by a security card I couldn't do that, I'd be apoplectic with rage.
Yeah, but then you'd have a bigger protest, wouldn't you? I mean, surely when the revolution comes...
Would it be online now? Like, do we just not protest in public spaces? Where would you go to protest?
When the revolution comes, the barricades are not going to be manned by people worrying about whether or not they're in the quasi-public realm. They'll just do it.
But lots and lots of people don't want to protest, but also want to protest legally. Like, if you're saying that the only things that you can protest about are the things that are going to cause a revolution, that's nonsense. The whole point of direct protest and direct action is that you're causing a scene or a commotion to get your point across.
Mike?
If you walk through any city centre these days, whether it's Bristol or Glasgow, there's two cities that I know really well, yeah, you do think it's public. But if the private investment hadn't have come, it would have been no change since the 80s. Bristol especially. Bristol's very much privately funded. Yeah, I see both sides of the point, but I think, to be honest, we'd be paying extortionate council fees in cities like Bristol, Leeds and Liverpool if the private investment hadn't come.
So on that point, James, so Granary Square in King's Cross, the one you mentioned, that was derelict buildings. Now it isn't because of Google and whatever. So what's the compromise that you'd like?
I think the compromise is that obviously we do need to have private investment in public spaces, because you can't judge the councils for taking the money, but it needs to be done with a sense of the public good. The kind of dream would be a privately owned public space that you weren't aware of, that basically acted like a public space. The thing is that the people involved in these building, the builders are just doing what their shareholders are told, but the architects, one of the chief architects in Zaha Hadid's company said last year that he wanted all of the public space in London to be privatised, because how often do you use Hyde Park? It's a cost. Like, having Hyde Park as not being able to be used as a private space is a cost to everyone. And that's the chief architect at Zaha Hadid. These are the people that are making big decisions and are being involved in these situations.
But it's true, isn't it? It does cost us money to maintain the royal parks. And actually, the fact that they are the royal parks means they are sort of owned by someone. It's just the royal family who are owned by us.
If you're arguing that parks don't improve London, then...
But that's not what he's arguing. He's saying let's keep the parks, but have private companies manage them.
No, he's saying let's build on Hyde Park. That's literally what he said.
But he's saying let's build parks on Hyde Park.
No, he's saying let's build to be able to get hold of social housing and housing provision. What is the point of Hyde Park as such a huge?
I'm not going to play devil's advocate to the extent that I say we should build on Hyde Park. Okay, fair enough. I suppose the other word that's sort of in the background of this conversation, Felicity, is gentrification, isn't it? Because actually these privately owned public spaces are quite pleasant if your intention is to go to Pret-a-Manger and sit and have a coffee on a bench and then go back to work. But if that's all we're left with, they're quite sterile, samey corporate environments.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who were okay with them were sort of saying, well, they are well maintained, they do look, probably a little bit too manicured, but they are nice. It's probably less antisocial behaviour. But there was, like you said, a feeling that they sort of overly sanitised, homogenised areas. They all sort of look the same, shiny kind of feel to them. And there's something like slightly eerie about that. I think in that sense, even if they are clean and hygienic and safer, I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing, really.
Have you walked down some of the high streets in Britain these days? The shops are boarded up, there's litter on the floor and no one's maintaining it. So that's another way of looking at it, right? So.
Yeah, but there's also the idea that if libraries are closing down, are more kids going to be doing their homework in McDonald's rather than a library? Are we going to the loos in Starbucks because there aren't public loos? There's something a bit weird about that. And actually Apple, I think, when they released the iPhone X, they were talking about...
10, it's pronounced 10.
Oh,
it's definitely pronounced 10, even though it's clearly written X and everyone would say X. It should be called the iPhone X. Clearly, they're idiots. Carry on.
Well, they were talking about they want to open town squares, so they're called Apple Town Squares.
Jamie's shaking his head, but it's true.
This is just making me apoplectic with rage.
Okay, so I saw this story too. They're rebranding their stores as town squares.
Yeah, sorry. And I think they're
not literally saying come here and have a protest.
No, I know, but there's
come
something
here and go
really,
to the toilet.
No, sure, but there's something really insidious about a huge company kind of adopting the language of things which should be public and should be democratic and governed by local authority laws. It's becoming like Apple are really smart in a really kind of nefarious way about this.
Surely what they're just recognising is that people go to the Apple store to check their email, and they're happy for people to do that because it means they're using Apple computers, they're more
But
likely
I think
to buy
it
one.
changes your mentality because you think you're going to a town square.
No
and there's
one
this-
thinks they're going to a town square
No,
when
I
they go
think
to
they
an
do. And
Apple
also,
store.
Look at the people who go to Disneyland and then live their lives there. People do think. People do
Sorry,
think
who
that
lives their lives in Disneyland?
people do half marathons and runs and everything in Disneyland as if it's like
The Mickey Mouse Marathon, why wouldn't you?
yeah, I think lots of people see Disneyland or these Apple town halls as certainly places that you could go and easily spend a lot of your time living your life there as if, like you said, it's insidious. The whole thing is insidious.
Okay. Give you another example that's a bit less kind of obviously grabby as a headline, right? Tesco and Sainsbury's and Morrison's and Asda will have a notice board where you can advertise your services as a cleaner or you've lost your cat. Are you saying they shouldn't do that because that's a public role? That's taking the community public space. It seems to me they're just saying, we know people are coming to our shop, so let's give them something else whilst they're here.
If you're drawing parallels with a security guard telling you to move on because you're looking grubby or something, if I put a note up on a supermarket board saying, people take arms, let's protest, and Tesco said, actually, sorry, we're taking that down, then it would be the same thing. So you'd be like, well, you're infringing on my rights and I don't really like that. I think it's when you decide as a citizen that you want to make a protest or something, and then someone comes along and says, actually, you can't do that. I think that's when the problem. So yeah, I think it's the same thing.
There is one other thing to this, isn't there, Mike, which is the internet is the public space now. And yes, okay, Twitter, etc., are also private companies, but more or less within the boundaries of the law, you can say what you want. So does it matter that there isn't a real space?
Yes and no. I mean, I think when you look at the online world, more governance needs to be there. But who's going to do it? The World Internet Forum? But when it comes to actual real space, I think you're talking about, when you look at something like Tesco's, a lot of newspapers, weekly newspapers in the UK over the last 5 years have closed down, and they've used the meeting rooms of Tesco's to have their local shopping centres. And it's like, well, that's fine on that case. You can't have it both ways. I mean, it's a talker, obviously.
But the big defining huge protest that, Arab Spring in Tahrir Square or the civil rights movements, they were physical people who got together in a space and changed history.
But we have that space. It's Trafalgar Square.
But
we have it.
But if you're
Canary
saying,
Wharf didn't exist before.
No, but if you're saying we
Now
can
it
just
does.
go online and do the same thing online, I'm saying a physical presence. I don't think you can. And I think in London, the more and more spaces that are encroached and more taken over by private companies, you're not going to allow people to do that.
I don't think you can look at the Egyptian revolution and compare it to what we're talking about in theory, because no, because with Egypt, nothing was going to stop that. That was hundreds of thousands of people who were.
But you know what might
going for
stop
it.
that?
Go on.
Privately owned public spaces. It might stop that. If they didn't have it, if they're unable to go and gather in peaceful protest, that's it.
Well, as Mike says, it's a talker. Next up, it's Felicity. What have you got for us this week?
What is technology doing to our children?
What is life like for you?
It's really, really tough because you just feel really miserable and depressed when you're not doing anything. And you just wonder what's the point in trying to do another day if you're just going to be miserable and miserable at the next day. I just don't want to get out of bed, but that's like most days. And recently I've just been really, I just hate leaving the house these days.
9-year-old Paul speaking to Radio 4's Today programme last year. Felicity, so children with depression, what's the turning point this week? Is it a good or a bad one?
It is a very bad one. This is new research, new government-funded research that has shown that a quarter of 14-year-old girls and 1 in 10 boys are showing signs of depression, which is pretty huge, really. The worst affected are mixed and white ethnic, and kids from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds are also probably the worst off as well.
But these kinds of studies get published all the time, and the general trend always seems to be more children are saying they're depressed than ever before. You do have to wonder what's special about this particular survey that, is such an earth-shattering moment.
I think a quarter of girls is pretty high. I think that's pretty staggering. I do agree. I think there is a lot of people who are saying that the rise could be down to a number of factors which are actually quite positive, like a greater willingness and a greater openness to talk about it. Certainly the royals and Theresa May have been given at a higher profile, and I think there is a more tendency to talk about our feelings and our mental health in a way that we've never done before. But I don't think that really takes away from the fact that this is a lot of very young, vulnerable kids saying they are seriously, seriously unhappy.
So, yeah, were kids always this unhappy and they just weren't being asked the question? Mike?
maybe they weren't. Now, I think as a kid, I didn't think I had the same stress or pressures of the social media age. You know, you'd moan about something and your parents would click you around the ear and say, get on with it. And I think that's how I was sort of brought up. But look, with nieces and nephews who are teenagers, yeah, it is stressful for them. It is, and the pressure is on them to have an exciting life in the online world, but also the pressures of being at home and then the actual pressures of growing up.
Yeah, it's interesting, this online argument, isn't it, Jamie? Because actually, if you look at the terms and conditions of Twitter and Facebook, they say you can't be a member till you're whatever it is. I think it's 14. But children are. And then everyone says, oh, isn't it terrible that these social media companies are making them all feel insecure? Why are parents letting their kids do it?
We're in such an interconnected world these days, and kids are much more computer literate than, like, even in the 15 years since I left primary school. I feel like I had a real slim knowledge and understanding of computers in comparison to what 11-year-olds have now. And to say that they can't go on Twitter or they can't go on Facebook is kind of naive, because I think that 10-year-olds today are much more aware of the world than they probably ever have been. And that then means that they will want to seem to be older. They will want to kind of get more involved in things like Twitter and Facebook. And I think just outright censorship is never the best policy, because from a parenting perspective, you're just going to make it seem more exciting.
I think it's also smartphones. There was a 2017 study that asked 5,000 US teens whether they had an iPhone, and 3/4 of them responded to say that they did. I mean, that's huge, and I don't think you've ever seen that in any other generation. The amount of kids who have these phones and these devices, and it affects pretty much every single part of their life. They're not sleeping so much. The number of kids who'll sleep with their phone under their pillow or by their bed, it's their alarm clock, it's how they wake up. And there's a lot more ways of bullying and social harassment. So if there's a really cool event going on, you haven't been invited, you will definitely know about that, because it will be plastered all over your social media channels that something cool's going on and you're not going to be there. I think also the idea of privacy in a way that, I think your teenage years have always been when for every generation, you're most vulnerable, most impressionable. These are your formative years, and you go out and you explore and you make mistakes. But there was a great article in the FT by Miranda Green over the weekend, which was saying, yeah, sure, you make mistakes, it's all stupid. But today, there's going to be records of it. There's going to be photos everywhere. You have Snapchat, which is all about sending these images. If you say a stupid comment, if you take a stupid photo, that's going to be there. This data is being stored. And that, I think, at my age is pretty terrifying. But I think if you're 14, I can see why they are, borderline suicidal over it.
I think it's irreversible now, this change. Like, all of those things are correct. And there are also things that affect us. I'm sure there was that Atlantic article about how smartphones are affecting adult depression levels and how people who are older than children. But this isn't something that we're going to be able to row back on, I don't think. So we have to look at how you treat it. And I think that particularly recently, but in general over the past 20 years, the government has really failed with mental health spending and has really failed in the way that it's always platitudes over action. I mean, just for example, 57% of clinical commissioning groups have said that they plan to reduce their spending on mental health services, and that's because of cuts. If you think that it's almost like it's a postcode lottery about how well your mental health provision is cared for. Some places will decide to spend 16% of the budget, whereas others will decide to spend barely anything at all. And that's not fair, because you want provision that's across the board for all children.
Is it just platitudes, though? Because I remember clearly during it was the coalition government, wasn't it? You could argue it was more the Lib Dems than the Tories, but nonetheless, there was a commitment, wasn't there, to put more money into mental health. Then I think under David Cameron's second government, there was a commitment to bring parity of mental health so that it was treated the same within the NHS as physical health. And then I remember when Theresa May became Prime Minister, in her famous Front of Number 10 speech, one of the things she spoke about was children's mental health. Are those platitudes? I got the impression that they were backed up with money.
But none of the funding for mental health has been ring-fenced. If they weren't platitudes, you would ring-fence mental health spending and just say, look, this is how much you are going to have to spend on mental health. And yes, they argue that they're aiming by 2021 to spend £11.6 billion on mental health. But it's just an aim at the moment, in the same way that David Cameron just had an aim to put it forward. And if you look at the numbers and at the figures, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't ring fence mental health spending if you really did care about it as much as they say they do.
You've also got to look at the knock-on effect into physical health as well, because obviously a lot of kids aren't going out playing football every night after school, and that's the big argument. And yeah, if they've got mental health issues, the physical situation is going to get even worse as well. So you're right. I mean, this money's got to be actually allocated and actually put forward.
And Felicity, from a weak junior perspective, obviously a lot of your readers are dealing with these issues. Is that something you bear in mind when you're editorialising the week's news for younger audiences?
I think we have to be very careful how we cover it, because I think what we want to avoid is sort of saying there's this terrible, awful problem and all these kids are on the brink of suicide and everything's awful and don't go online, it's the scariest thing, and your phone is this awful, terrible thing. I think we have to find ways to write about it in a way that's going to say, what can you do to use it in a more positive way and to make the most out of your social media life?
Okay, but that's the technology thing. But
Yeah.
we've actually just got kind of anecdotal correlation, not causation there, haven't we? But what if we know that, children and teenagers are more depressed than they used to be? Forget about the technology side of it. How do you deal with that?
I think the fact in a way that we've been recognising it and acknowledging it is a good thing. So I think that kids don't have to feel it's just something they go away with and think it's just them. So I think if there is more of a forum where it can be discussed and it's not such a taboo subject as it used to be, that can only be a positive thing.
You just look at how children engage with media and say if it's vloggers talking about their mental health more, that's a good thing. If it's books and magazines being based around depression as a thing, getting rid of the taboo around mental health that still does exist is a big problem for adults, and it needs to be passed down to children. In my head, it could be that it was as simple as having children's books that do have characters that have depression, have characters that have mental health issues, and not be afraid to engage with children at a level of 5, 6, 7 and say, yeah, this is a problem that does affect young people.
Mike, what have you got for us?
The Fed Express wants to change tennis forever.
I just hope to leave a legacy behind, not for me personally, but just for the game, because it deserves it. It deserves players, and the legends of this game deserve the recognition they deserve. The future players deserve a massive platform to play tennis in. The likes on our team, the young guys, and Dominic and Sasha, they hopefully play for years and decades to come this competition. So for me as an older guy with Rafa and other guys on the team, it was a pleasure taking part in the very first one.
Roger Federer there talking to reporters this week about the inaugural Laver Cup, which, Mike, I think I'm right in saying is another tennis tournament. Is that really going to change the world?
It is. It's a team tournament though, and it's being styled and billed as the tennis's answer to the Golf Ryder Cup, which obviously over the last 10 years has become quite a big thing in sport, and TV rights have been huge. And
Okay, so it's tennis's answer. Is that a question anyone was asking?
This is actually something that Federer's agent had actually come up with. There are other tennis team tournaments, but this one, with Roger Federer's name behind it, the difference is he will attract not only big name players, but sponsors, and the captains were Bjorn Borg and McEnroe. Obviously, everyone's talking about their tennis film recently. So Federer's always going to attract a lot of press, and the fact is, I think it's been quite a success in the first issue.
Why? Why are the fans into it?
The tennis was unbelievable. Federer and Nadal were playing doubles for the first time in a long time, and to see those guys going up against anyone, okay, exhibitions they've done, but this was proper tennis, proper rules, proper laws. Okay, can you compare it to a Grand Slam? Probably not, but the fact is they were playing properly. Big serves, big shots.
Felicity.
Well, wasn't it really uneven though? I thought, because it was Team World versus Team Europe, which I just love that. I think it sounds hilarious. Team World versus Team Europe. And Team World had to beat the US and everything else in it, whereas Team Europe, because they are the best at the moment, were just the best. But then in terms of the names, like you said, you had Federer, you had Nadal. And then on Team World, it didn't really seem they had any names that could match up, which I thought, was that not I didn't watch it, but was that not a problem during the tournament?
Maybe, but and also if you actually looked at the players that Europe were missing, Djokovic, Wawrinka, Murray, if you add them with Federer and Nadal, that is your top 5 in the world. They're all European. Okay, US tennis in the men's game is actually not in a good state at the moment. But maybe 10 years down the line, this is where the world can come back and actually have this to aspire to.
Do you not feel like there's a kind of saturation point that you reach with tennis? You might end up with peak tennis where if people are chasing dollars and playing the Grand Slam the whole time, we end up in a situation where even as just a kind of small-time tennis fan, how do I choose where to look if there's just tennis round the clock all the time?
I think looking at it from a fitness point of view, I mean, the US Open on the men's side was a shambles this year. I mean, 3 big names couldn't play, and they said, no, my body cannot take a 4th Grand Slam. And let's be honest, it was only August, September. You know, they have the ATP finals coming up in November, which is the last one. Okay, they have 3 or 4 weeks off, then they go straight to Australia, and then it's all happening again. So I think actually this is the problem with this event, is where do they fit it into the schedule? It's proposed to happen every year 2 weeks after the US Open.
But there was also a big scandal in terms of at Wimbledon of players turning up injured in their first round, then pulling out after 3 or 4 games just for the paycheck, which suggests that there is still in tennis a big disparity between those at the top that have a lot of money and those through the hundreds that end up turning up injured. It just wouldn't work in any other scenario. I couldn't turn up to work here, but just like, but I'm desperate for the money. You know, if I was freelancing and then end up throwing up everywhere, it wouldn't work. You wouldn't be allowed in. But somehow in tennis, it seems to be.
Yeah, I think when you look at it at Wimbledon, the wild card is the critical talking point for that. A lot of the British players do get them, and it's good to have Brits on the outside courts, up and coming players. But if they are getting whooped, 6-love, you got to be thinking, was that wild card worth it?
And how does tennis compare to other international sports, football, cricket, in terms of this physical demand on players?
Well, you look at rugby, that's the big talking point this week, was Billy Vanapola saying that the season is too long, and he pulled out of the Lions tour of New Zealand because he was battered and bruised, was his words. He's just started his season, and then he's out for 4 months now with a knee injury. I mean, this is... all sport at the top level is going to be hard on the body. I mean, whatever you say. But in football, for example, it's a squad game. Perhaps rugby needs more substitutions. Perhaps they need more players playing the game. They don't need more matches. That's a fact.
If you're more likely to get injured, aren't you just a weaker athlete?
Tell Usain Bolt that.
I'm just thinking though. I mean, are the strongest, fittest athletes who can take on more? Aren't they just better than the ones if you can't do it and you're injured, then get out?
Yeah, I mean, to be a professional at any top-level sport.
Get in the ice bath more often.
Yeah, I mean, Nadal had a couple of years there where his knees and ankles were shot.
Well, it's thanks to my incredible sportsman-like resilience that I'm here week on week on the Week Unwrapped. But thank you to my flaky panel who just appear when they want to, Felicity Capon, Mike Starling and Jamie Timson. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk. You can also sign up to our free email newsletter, The Weekday, whilst you're there, or sign up to have the magazine delivered direct to your door at theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And remember, if you've stumbled across this show on some far-flung corner of the internet, that you can also listen to every episode on our podcast feed. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice, Town Square or otherwise. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.